Biggest mistakes when installing these receptacles. All right, so for this first mistake, it comes down to selecting the proper receptacle for the circuit you're installing it on. Now, this is a 15 amp receptacle. This is a 20 amp receptacle. Well, when you go to select which receptacle you're going to install on a circuit, you need to know what wiring is running in that wall and what circuit breaker is on that circuit. So, super important that you choose the proper receptacle for the circuit that you are installing it on. You can put 15 amp receptacles on a 20 amp circuit with 12 gauge wire, but you can never put a 20 amp receptacle on a 15 amp circuit with 14 gauge wire, or you run the risk of starting a fire. All right, so for this next really big mistake, it comes down to reverse polarity. We've got our gold terminal screws over here, and we've got our white neutral wire connected to those screws. That is where some people will mistakenly take their hot or black line wire and tighten it down on this side. This is completely backwards, and that's why it's referred to as reverse polarity. When you plug an appliance into this receptacle, it is now being fed the power on the neutral side, or the incorrect side of this receptacle on this hole right here. When that happens, that means that power is not only flowing into this receptacle the wrong way, but it's then flowing into whatever you're plugging into this the wrong direction as well. And that can lead to damaging whatever it is that you're installing it into. So this is what it should look like. Your black or hot wire should be going to the brass colored screws. In some cases they look very gold, and white or neutral always goes to the light side, which is silver. All right, so for this next really big mistake, this comes down to not getting the terminal screws tightened down properly. Over time, this wire could become very loose and eventually come off of that terminal screw, or if it doesn't come off the terminal screw, all it has to do is be loose just like that. And this can actually cause arcing to happen in that box. Arcing can lead to all kinds of things, including a fire. Typically speaking, the terminal screws will need to be tightened down to between 9 and 14 inch-pounds. And the mistake that comes in when using these residential grade receptacles is when we turn it over here to the back, there are these speed wiring or backstabbing holes right here. But I know too many electricians, and I've seen it for myself, where these are prone to fail. There's a very thin piece of metal inside of this outlet here that when you go and you insert your 14 gauge wire, because that's the max that they usually accept, and you push it in to one of those speed wiring holes. So now it's in there, it's locked into place. That very thin piece of metal is holding that down, and over time, due to the heating that comes with using a receptacle, they get loose over time, and sometimes it's fairly quickly, to where you might start seeing your receptacles are working intermittently. That causes that arcing, it gets very hot, and fires can happen. It is far better to use this side wiring, which is the terminal screws, making sure you have that nice mechanical connection. And once you have that nice mechanical connection, you're gonna have that good connection for many, many years, and you don't have to worry about it. All right, so for this next really big mistake, this is also incredibly, incredibly common, and that's when somebody takes their receptacle, they take their freshly stripped wiring, they put it around the terminal screw, they go and they tighten it down, and they think this is good. Well, do you see the issue with this? Yeah, the big mistake here is they stripped off way too much insulation. This is going to be energized when power is flowing to this receptacle. And with this wiring just being exposed, that can pose a serious risk for arcing, which then can lead to overheating. It can lead to short circuits, and it can lead to fire. Now, conversely, if I go ahead and I take this wire off of this terminal screw, and then I flip it over here to this other side, then I tighten that one down. Well, do you see the issue with this one? Yeah, not enough insulation was removed. And if we look up underneath of that terminal screw there, we can see that that insulation is up underneath of that terminal screw, which means that we're not getting a good connection with the wiring either. And if this wire was to move at all, because the terminal screw was not clamped down all the way onto the wiring, if that was to move at all, now it becomes super loose. A loose wire has the potential for leading to overheating and possible fires. So it is incredibly important to make sure that you are stripping off the proper amount of insulation to where you do not have any exposed coming out of the back, but where you do have enough cut off to where the copper that's on that wire is completely underneath of this terminal screw and making contact with it. All right, so for this next really big mistake, this is probably the most common mistake that DIYers make when installing these receptacles. So the issue with this is I wrapped my J-hook around this terminal screw in the incorrect direction. I wrapped it around it in a counterclockwise direction. So what it's naturally going to want to do as we're tightening this down is it's going to want to push that wire out and away from the terminal screw, which is going to create a suboptimal connection. Now this is especially true with stranded wire. So if I wrap that stranded wire around that terminal screw in a counterclockwise direction and I start to tighten that terminal screw down, watch what happens to all of those strands. See how it's pushing it away from the terminal screw? Because that terminal screw was being turned in the opposite direction as those strands were going around it. By putting around in that clockwise direction, it should cause those strands and that wiring to be pulled in tighter to that terminal screw. And so as you can see, just like that, it did exactly that. It did not push the strands out and away to where they would be loose. It grabbed onto those wires, especially the tighter it got, and it helped to wrap it around the center of that terminal screw to where it's nice and tight, and there's going to be a very good connection here for a very long time. All right, so for this next really big mistake, I call this one the double stacker. And that's when people are wanting to tie into a circuit somewhere, whether they want to install lights with a light switch or they want to add a receptacle somewhere, and they're going to use a receptacle as a means for supplying that power. So they take the existing receptacle out, they see that both terminal screws already have wires underneath of them. They will then just take one of the terminal screws, they will loosen it up, they will then take their new wiring that they're wanting to tie into this receptacle here, and they will wrap it up underneath of that terminal screw just like that, and then they will go and they will tighten it down. Well, this is a huge no-no because over time it does not take much for one of these wires to shift a little bit, and if just one of these wires gets a little bit loose, well then the other one is too. You could run the risk of one of the wires completely coming off of the terminal screw or them just being in there loose, which can lead to overheating and possible fire hazards. So for this next big mistake, this is another really common one, of course, and that comes down to when you go to replace a receptacle with a new one, or you're just wanting to install a different device, you remove the receptacle out of the box, you go and you take your wiring off of that receptacle. And then whether you're installing a new receptacle and you want to use the same wiring again, what a lot of people will do is they will just take that hook because they know that it needs to be straightened out, and then they'll go to install this into the receptacle, tighten it down, and they will think this is good. When I went and I straightened this wire out, I weakened this wire. Well, when the original hooks were made, when this copper got bent, it actually weakened the copper. But just bending it that one way is totally fine. Problem comes in, especially with copper, when you go and start bending it other directions, it causes it to become work hardened. And when it becomes work hardened, it becomes very brittle and very easy for it to then break off, especially at the point as to where that hook originally started at, because that's where the majority of the force was put. And this is especially true if you've got a wire that's got nicks on it already. When you go to straighten this out, it's going to make it extremely brittle to where over time it really would not be surprising for that copper to just break off. So it's extremely important that when you go and take these J-hooks off of terminal screws, especially ones that have been there for a while, cut that original J-hook off, re-strip the wire, and if it's going into a commercial grade and it just needs to be straight like this, well, perfect. Then you just put it in and then tighten it down. Or if you need loops again for the new receptacle, then you can make a new J-hook and you're not going to have any issues there at all because this has not been work hardened to where it's going to cause it to snap off.